doorways. Bricks them up with stone, so he'll have room to carve his own name on the doorways, and carves his exploits on the doorways of his father's temple, and says it is a good son who completes his father's monument. Right? So in a sense, he completes his father's monument, but takes a lot of credit for himself. So he goes to Abydos and completes his father's temple. But he also builds his own temple at Abydos behind Dad's. So he's got his own temple there. He also completes the hypostyle hall that Seti, his father, had begun. And if you go to the hypostyle hall today, you will see it with Ramses' name on it. You're not going to see Seti's name all over it. Ramses loved to put his own name. We sometimes call Ramses the Great Chiseler because he carved out so many other people's names and put his own on. We call him the Great Chiseler. But he builds. Now, military. That's where it's at for Ramses. Year 5 of his reign, 5th year as king of Egypt, he marches out to Syria. This is going to be the battle that will make his reputation for life. Now, Ramses is going to rule for another 62 years. Rules for 67 years, but in the 5th year of his reign, he fights a battle that he will talk about for another 6 decades. The Battle of Kadesh. It's in Syria. And as I mentioned, his father had gone there and conquered. It's a long march, as you know from when we talked about the military. It's about 15 miles a day, right? Marching to Syria. You go through the Bekaa Valley. You see flowers these guys had never seen before. Wildflowers. We have the details of this battle. Let me tell you about this battle. We have so many details of this battle. Ramses talked about it so much, carved it on so many temples. This is the best recorded event in ancient history. There is no other historical event of which we have so much detail and so many accounts. Right? Ramses really liked it. He's marching out, right? He, of course, isn't marching. He's in his chariot. The infantry's marching. And there were 4 military divisions, we are told. We know they divided themselves into military divisions. They are named after the gods. There's one for Amun, one for Re, one for Ptah. Right? So we have Amun for Thebes. Re is the solar god. Right? His name is Rameses. Right? Amun, Re, Ptah for Memphis, the other capital of Egypt. And Seth. Seth, remember his father is Seti the First. Right? So Seth is taken care of too. We have 4 divisions. 5,000 men each. Right? So we've got about 20,000. We've got chariots. We've got archers. And they're marching north to Syria. Town after town they go through, they simply take. No resistance. No problem for an army like this. And understand, moving 20,000 men is not easy. Anybody in the military knows that. You got supply problems. That's the big one. How do you feed 20,000 men? You can't carry enough food. If you're moving with donkeys as your pack animal, a donkey can carry maybe enough food for 2 days for itself and its rider. No way. You have to forage where you're going. Take whatever the land has, and that's what they did. So they're marching north, right? Even wells are a problem. You know, if you have an army of 20,000 and you come to a town where there are 4 wells, you'll die of thirst. You cannot water 20,000 people quickly enough from a few wells. So you had to know what you were doing, and you planned your timing, right? So he's...
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another conversation on ancient Egypt. Our speaker is Professor Bob Breyer, Long Island University. So, for years upon years, we've been told that Ramses the Great was the pharaoh during the enslavement of the Jews. So, I found it interesting that the life and times of Ramses the Great would be mentioned in this series. And with that, let's get into it.
Marching north to Kadesh. Now, Ramses is nearing Kadesh. It's a dramatic story told by Ramses. We don't know exactly what the truth is, but let me give you the official Egyptian account and then we'll talk about it. Rameses is leading his army. Now he's young, remember. Year 5, 23, who knows how old, 24, max. And he's leading the army. He's been out on campaigns, though. He's not afraid. He's leading the army. And they're nearing Kadesh. As they near Kadesh, 2 locals come up to him, join the camp. Right? 2 locals. And they say to Rameses, we want to join your camp. We want to join Ramses' camp. And Rameses has them interrogated. He says, where's the enemy? Now the enemy, Mutwalis, he's a Hittite, right? The Hittites controlled Kadesh all the way from Turkey. They controlled Syria. He says, where's the enemy? And these 2 guys say, well, they heard you were coming, Rameses the Great, and they fled north. They're 100 miles north. Right? In truth, Mutwalis had 40,000 troops, 2,500 chariots hidden in the woods, a little bit north, near Kadesh. Rameses believes these guys. Makes sense to him. They're afraid of me. And he proceeds ahead of his army. Now, when you've got 20,000 men, you can't march together. It's too many. You usually divide up among divisions, and you've got maybe 5,000 moving ahead. That's plenty. And they sometimes camp as much as a day apart because they've got to get their own food, water. You can't just supply everybody at once. Rameses, hearing that the enemy's not near, charges on ahead on his own. Right? He's got 1 division with him, right? And he's marching to Kadesh. What Rameses doesn't know, of course, is Mutwalis is waiting. Right? Waiting. Rameses goes on ahead. Behind him, the division of Ray is attacked. They're in real trouble. Rameses marching on, sets up camp. Right? He sets up camp. And we have descriptions of what's happened. We have pictures of the camp that Rameses actually set up. Remember I told you once before they put their Egyptian shields to form a wall? That's what they did. And it's a wonderful scene on the walls. You can see guys repairing chariots, carrying supplies. You can see Rameses' pet lion. He went into battle with his lion. Right? They're setting up camp, and they find 2 spies from Mutwalis, and they beat the truth out of these guys. That Mutwalis is in the woods. But it's too late. The Hittites attack the camp, and it's all confusion. They're not ready for battle. They're outnumbered. Everybody's scattering. Rameses says, what, are you afraid? He says, I'll fight him by myself. Right? Myself. And he jumps in his chariot. And he counterattacks the Hittites. Now, we don't know exactly what happens. The description is pretty much that Rameses, with very few people behind him, repels the Hittites. Rameses saves the day. Everybody's panicking, and Rameses says, don't worry. I've got Amun behind me. Right? And he charges. Hittites retreat. And there are even scenes of the Hittites retreating. Wonderful. Now remember, this is Kadesh in Syria. They're right near the Orontes River. And the Hittites are pushed back across the Orontes by Rameses. And there's a scene on a temple wall that Rameses later carved of a prince of Aleppo, right, in Syria, who was fighting with the Hittites. And the guy almost drowned in the river, and it shows them holding him upside down so the water's coming out of him, right? They're shaking the water out of this prince of Aleppo. So, anyway, Rameses saves the day. The rest of the troops come north and join the camp. Now, it's nightfall. Egyptians did not fight battles at night. Right? Ancient world in general, you did not fight at night, so you're going to wait for the next day. But at least now, Rameses and his troops, they know that Mutwalis is there on the other side of the river. Day breaks, and there is a battle between the Egyptians and the Hittite forces for Kadesh. The best that we can determine from the records we have, and it's only one-sided, is it was a standoff. Mutwalis had the numbers, had outnumbered Rameses. Rameses' men were really trained, skilled. It was a standoff. Nobody won. There are scenes of the battle, and there are ways of telling the good guys from the bad guys. Remember I told you once about the round top shields as the Egyptians, the other guys? Well, chariots also. Egyptians always have 2 guys on a chariot. Hittites have 3. They've got a bigger chariot. They have a spear thrower too. They got a guy. So you can tell pretty clearly who's who, what's happening. And it was a standoff. And Rameses is offered, right? Is offered a peace treaty. He refuses. He won't take a peace treaty. He will only take a temporary truce. Now, what's the difference? Well, one is a long-term thing where you say, well, we're not going to fight anymore. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. Ramses says no. He said, we'll take a truce, but I'm going to be back, right? So Ramses refuses a treaty and returns to Egypt. Now, this is a battle that becomes the equivalent of George Washington crossing the Delaware. It is carved on every temple Ramses builds. It is spoken about for years about how Ramses, as an individual, the king leading his army, saved the day, right? And there's probably some truth in it. There is. Because there were a lot of soldiers coming back with Ramses. And if he hadn't done something pretty brave, there would have been talk. So I think Ramses really did do something great. Maybe not as great as he said, but it's good. So Ramses, early on in his career, establishes himself as a great military leader. Now, what about his building, right? Various ways that Pharaoh wanted to show he was great. One of the strategic things Ramses does, and it's important, is he moves the capital of Egypt. Now remember, there are 2 capitals really. Thebes is the religious capital. And Thebes, by the way, is what the Greeks called it. That's not what the Egyptians called it.
As
The
usual.
Egyptians called ancient Thebes Waset.
What's
It's a scepter. It means power. It was the place of power, Waset. So the ancient Egyptians called it Waset. The Greeks, when they came in, called it Thebes. And the modern Egyptians called it Luxor. There was the religious capital
wow?
at Thebes and the administrative capital at...
So wait a minute. Luxor Temple was called Thebes, which was actually something else by the ancient Egyptians. I never knew that. Oh, I never put them together because I've always heard the terms used separately. You know, you hear about Luxor Temple. You know, oh, okay, that's a pretty nice replica of Luxor Temple. Then when you read the books or you're listening to you're watching the videos, the historical videos, they refer to it as Thebes. But I never knew Thebes and Luxor were based on the same county, the same landmass. It's the same exact thing. It's just named differently. It's like somebody changing the name to the Empire State Building. So then 100 years from now, they call it by another name, thinking that the Empire State Building and this new building, even though they look the same, it's 2 different buildings, but in actuality, it's the same building. It's just named differently. Interesting.
Memphis. But Ramses moves the administrative capital from Memphis to the Delta. Now, why? To Cantir, actually. It's modern Cantir. It's called P-Ramses, the city of Ramses. Why? Because the Delta is more strategic if you're a military man. It's difficult to imagine what being a military man was like. I mean, you had a plan for going through deserts, marching endlessly. And if you're going through the Delta, you could have store cities built there. It's a place where you can move out north towards Syria, and Ramses intended to go to Syria often. So it was strategically better placed for a military man. That's why he wants his palace in the Delta. Now, in addition to this Delta area, and it's a strange area to see today because you know the delta's moist, so most of the site is sunken underground. You can still see places where Ramses, built though. It's amazing. Big stones still lie on the ground. But anyway, in addition to the palace, he builds his famous temple at Abu Simbel. Now, if you'll remember, the border of Egypt ended at Aswan in the south. Ended there. Abu Simbel is south of Aswan, in Nubia. And Abu Simbel, which is the modern name for it, Abu Simbel is a unique temple. Nothing like it had ever been built. Ramses has a new technique. Normally a temple is built out of blocks, built one on top of the other, very much like you build a brick house. Ramses carved the temple of Abu Simbel out of the mountain, out of the living rock. In the front of this temple, carved out of the mountain, are 4 67-foot high statues of Ramses the Great. 4 of them. And you enter the temple between the legs of the innermost two. When you look at the temple today, one of the statues' heads is on the ground. It fell during an earthquake. During the life of Ramses, after it had been built, there was an earthquake, and the head fell down. Now, this temple is a great piece of propaganda. Let me explain why I say propaganda. No large number of people ever lived there. This was Nubia, not Egyptian soil. Egyptians weren't going to live there for a long time. This was to show, if you were a Nubian, sailing northward on the Nile into Egypt, you would have to pass this big, big temple with 67-foot statues of Ramses looking down on you. Now, if you were brave enough to get off your boat and look around inside the temple, as you go inside the temple, right on the walls, just at the entranceway, are bound captives. Nubians. It's a statement. It's a political statement. Then, if you're brave enough to go inside, you will see Ramses winning the Battle of Kadesh. Wonderful scenes, the Orontes River circling the town. Pretty impressive stuff. And then, going all the way into the Holy of Holies, what do you have? You got 4 statues. The gods, right? You got Re-Harakti, you got Ptah, you got Amun, and you got Ramses the Great, right there with the gods, same size. So you've got Ramses as a god. And the temple is designed beautifully so that twice a year, the sun shines all the way into the Holy of Holies and illuminates the statues. Right? Special day. Many people feel it was on Ramses' birthday. It was designed so that on Ramses' birthday, the sun would illuminate those statues of Ramses with the gods. Incredible. Now, to build this temple was a major effort. Nothing like it ever done. Imagine how they did it. You had to have guys on scaffolds coming from the top of the mountain, and they would put down a grid work. They would take big buckets probably of red paint, paint the red line, the grid, and then the sculptors would come hanging and carve out these statues, all for propaganda. But this is not the only temple there. Ramses also built a second temple, just to the right of him, for his wife, Nefertari, the beautiful Nefertari. And above the doorway has a lovely inscription. It says, Nefertari, she for whom the sun does shine. It's nice, isn't it? So they have his and her temples, sort of